And for those that don't know, Allan Richardson is a previous president of the club. So, yeah, welcome back, Al.
No worries. So look, I probably should introduce myself to those that don't know me, but I guess most of the people there I know. So I've been birding ever since I was a child. Always had a screw loose for birds ever since I can remember, drawing them when I was a kid, and then growing and finally meeting people a little bit later in life who had the same passion as me. And moved on from there, and now they pay me to watch birds. But this whole program that I put together here is really for beginning birders, because I remember very, very well the problems that I had when I was a beginning birder, trying to identify and get a handle on these range of different things. But we'll get started, and now you titled the name of it just a little bit wrong, because I call them not little brown jobs but small brown job, SBJs. But anyway, let's go.
Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. So it's pitched at new birders. We're going to talk about ID problems and ID strategies, and then some different species. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at the local thornbill species that you can get in the Hunter region. Thornbills occur across a wide range of different habitats, and so you can generally encounter one or two of those species just about in many of the habitats that you go through in the Hunter. You'll find one of the thornbills present. And there's a range of birds that give you ID pitfalls against them. So we're going to talk about the thornbills, and maybe getting to know them better will help you to separate them from those species that are a little bit more difficult. So there is a wide range of different ones. There's a couple of birds there that aren't thornbills, actually 3, some scrub wrens, but you already know them very well. They're that bird that you see disappearing just as you're getting the binoculars on them, or just will not show themselves from behind the foliage so you can get to know them. They offer the back end of them so you can't get a handle on what's going on up the front, or they'll just hide in the undergrowth and give you trouble. Look, so what we'll do, I said it was going to be pitched for beginning birders, so most people have got a fairly good handle on using their binoculars, but it's amazing how many people don't. I've gone and led outings for councils on showing people birds, and many of the people that come along and bring a pair of binoculars along don't really know how to get the very best out of them. They struggle with them, and it's amazing when you ask a question to a mixed group, how few people put up their hands when you ask the question, have you had a really good experience that you can remember at looking at a bird through binoculars? And it's because they're just frustrated with how to use the thing. So the key thing with your binoculars is that there's 3 different ways that you can adjust them. Firstly, you'll notice those 2 dots that you can see in the middle of the glass are the exit pupils of the binoculars, and you have to adjust the binoculars at the back so that those 2 exit pupils line up with your pupils. So you can move those in and out by looking through them until you get them to the place where they're comfortable. You've got a bright view and it's not obscured by the edges of the ocular view. Then not everybody's eyes are exactly the same. So the right ocular assembly on the binoculars all have an adjustment. So what you do is you close your right eye and you use the main focus dial to get your left eye focused, and then you open, you close your left eye and look through your right eye, and then you adjust that little green, where that green thing, you turn that little ocular assembly until it adjusts your right eye. And then when you open up, you should be in about the ballpark, but I always find that it's better to have both eyes open while you're turning the right-hand ocular assembly. It tends to come really clear. Some binoculars, when they get old, the adjustment in the focus actually gets a bit of slop in it. And so what will happen is when you're zooming back, it might be clear, but when you zoom out the other way, one of the sides lags a bit and it'll make it go out. So you adjust with your binoculars by going a little bit too far and then coming back so that you get it in focus with those things. So there's the third thing. It's funny that many birders are actually really, really intelligent people. And that's your first problem in actually IDing birds, because generally we try to identify them by colour, and that's a bit of a pitfall. But there's, there was another thing about binoculars, but don't worry about that. Let's move on. You'll notice these birds are all Australian birds, but they're all black in colour. And yet you can easily tell, well, you should be able to easily tell what each of those species are, even though they haven't got their name written up there. You can see the forked tail of the drongo. You can see the short tail and the hooked bill of a paradise riflebird. And number 2, you can see the trumpet manicoid with a little bit of a cone coming out the back and a rounded longish tail. You can see the black butcherbird's, he's got a bill like a magpie, that two-tone colour. You can see the shape of the brown falcon, the black cockatoo, and so forth. There's even the starling and the blackbird are really easy to pick apart. Probably the most difficult amongst the dark birds to pick apart is the difference between the different corvids. So the last 2 there, you would have a raven at in number 17, because he's got longer throat hackles, and that could be a Teresian crow or a little raven in 16. There's chuff, currawong, and all the rest. So let's go to the next slide. I want you to have a look at this, this slide here, and don't call out any colours or anything, but get an idea of what you think that colour is. And now on the next slide, have a look at that colour and see what colour you actually think that is. It's quite different to the other one. Now, if we go over to this next picture, you'll see that there's a house, a shed, and a car in this picture. Now, if I was to ask you what colour the car is and what colour the shed is and what colour the house is, everybody would say, well, they're all white. But that's because you've done a little trick in your head. You know, right, that they're all white by the context that you're seeing in them. And so you can easily tell by the experiences of life that you have that these are all white things. So the car, the shed, and the house. Yet those 2 pictures that I just showed you back there, this one which looks blue and this one that looks yellow, are both pictures of details on that car in that picture. So the yellow one is the car in sunlight, and the blue one is the car in the shade, because the blue of the sky reflects down onto surfaces that are in the shade and makes them look blue. So when you see a bird out in the bush, you have no, and it's a new one to you, have no idea what colour it really is. It looks like a colour. So if you would ask a child what colour cloud they see in a late afternoon sky where the sun is being blocked by the clouds, they'll often say that they're purple, and yet we think that they're grey. But the child is right. They are actually purple in colour. And this is what happens to experienced birders even when they encounter a new species in unusual light. They'll judge it on the colour that they're actually seeing, and what that ends up being is a pitfall that trips them up. I've had many, many birds described to me that just don't exist. Oh, it had a purple head and it had an orange belly, and And it was because when they saw the bird, they actually judged it on the colours they actually saw instead of going by the distribution of colour. There are other things that can trip us up with birds as well. But here's some examples of colour. You can see this brown gerygony in this picture. Because it's under a canopy, it's actually got a greenish yellow hue about it because the light is being filtered through the green canopy. But if you correct the colour and make it neutral, that's actually the colour that a brown gerygony is. It's actually white. Oops, daisy. It's actually white underneath. It's not that yellowy colour that you might think it is if you'd never seen the bird before. So it can trip you right up. Look at this bird here, which is a young golden whistler. It looks a certain way. And if we compare it to this bird that's in the light, it's actually quite different. And yet, both of these birds here are exactly the same bird. That one there is in the shade, and then it hopped out into the sun, and I took a photo of it in the sun. So you can see how quickly and easily you can get tripped up by looking at a bird. If you were to see this bird and then go and compare it to a field guide, you'd be looking for a drab, dull, fairly dark olive bird. But in this case, you'd probably be looking for something else. And with that brings us to the next big problem that we have as experienced birders, field guides. The trouble with the bird in mind is that we try to actually identify birds by details. So what we do is we go to a field guide and we look in the field guide and we see a brown thornbill, for instance, in this picture here, and we imprint on that, and we go out into the field and we try to find something that exactly fits that. But that'll never happen because there's no brown thornbills that look exactly like that picture. And here's a couple of examples. So what I'm going to do is show you some pictures from 4 different field guides, which will show you, right? So I'm not going to tell you which Australian field guides. So we've got the first one here, the second one there, this one here, which is quite different, and then this one here. Now, all of those birds are represented quite differently in the different field guides. And now compare them with a real brown thornbill, as you can see here. So you can see that there's quite a bit of difference between what's in the field guide and what's in reality. So if you were imprinting on something like this, you'd be looking at something. Now it says there's a dull rump is dull cinnamon. Now it could be just the bad printing of a certain run of the books that they didn't get the printer didn't get the colours right. But right, you'd be still looking for that cinnamon rump that you can see in that picture there. So yes, it can be very, very difficult if you take a detailed mind to actually trying to work out what the bird is. Now, in actual fact, each of the field guides are exactly correct. If you look in this image here, you can see that a brown thornbill, there's only a couple of different thornbills in our region that have striations on its breast. It has a dark reddish, a darker eye and not a white eye like some other thornbills. And it's got this chestnut scalloping on its forehead. So those things, that overall brownish hue, which can be tricked by the light, is actually shouldn't be used as the dominant thing to find out, but it should be the different plumage features that it have that make it distinct. And there is no other bird in our region that has a striated breast, a red eye, and a scalloped chestnut forehead other than the brown thornbill. In fact, in that size, you won't find any bird like that anywhere. There is another bird that is closely approximates that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. If you look in these pictures of the field guides, you can see in this picture here, you've got the scalloping on the forehead, you've got the red eye, and you've got the striations on the throat and the breast, and the same in this picture. Now the striations on the breast look a little weird here. You'd be looking for something that had lines down its breast, so that's not exactly correct, and yet it's still a representation of what a brown thornbill truly is. So it's getting the hang of the idea that what we've got to look for is the distribution of colour and markings and not the colour itself. This one's getting closer to the mark, but I think probably this one by Nicholas Day could be probably the best out of the lot and looks a little bit more like the bird than anything else. Okay. So look, the way that that experienced birders actually identify birds is we don't just open up a book and try and find one bird out of the 750 that are in the book. If you take most field guides that you have in your hand and you don't have in your app anymore, on your phone anymore, but if most field guides, if you open them up basically to the middle, you'll end up around the parrots. And so just a few pages past the parrots, you stop seeing all of the non-passerines, and then from the rest of the book, you've got all of the passerines in the back. So that's one way to divide the birds up so that you actually got a smaller amount to look at. But another really, really great way to be able to reduce the amount of birds that you could possibly see is distribution. In our location where the red dot is, there's only I know we've got, nearly 450 birds on our list, or just over 450 birds on the hunter list now, which is a well over half of the birds that we could see here. And yet, at any given time, if you take all of the vagrants away and all of the seabirds, and then you change different habitats that you go to, you'll only have a subset of those birds at any given location, because most birds don't live across all different habitats. They have special preferences for the habitats they use. And then, of course, we divide it up through the way that they use their habitat. So whenever I go into any place and I'm birding, I usually have a list of maybe around 200 birds that I would expect to see there. Doesn't mean that I wouldn't allow something outside of that list to occur there, because you need to have your radar up. But generally, you'll have a much smaller list than the guide actually has when you go into an area. But then you can divide it up in other ways. Some birds will use open habitat, and some birds will use wooded habitat. So you've got different types of habitat. You've got wet type sclerophyll or rainforest type habitats, and you've got dry open woodland with scrubby understories. And then all of those different habitats are broken up into different strata. So you've got the ground level, you've got low shrubs. For instance, mostly scrub wrens will walk on the ground, and yet a bird that uses low shrubs like the brown thornbill only rarely descends to the ground, maybe to just pick up nesting material. Then you've got tall shrubs, you've got the mid-story, and then you've got birds that like to be in the canopy. So, anyway, we'll talk about some of the idiosyncrasies of the different species a little bit later. And then there's a whole bunch of confusion species. And look, part of the problem with a confusion species is one that was highlighted when we were talking about the new book, and that is the size of the bird. Now, there's not a humongous, well, there is. You could fit probably 4 brown thornbills into a golden whistler, this golden whistler here. But the whistlers are something, when you're a new birder, that you could actually think, oh, is this some sort of a thornbill? Particularly if you've got no scale, it's a little bit distant, it may look small to you, and you don't know how big a thornbill is anyway. So there's a couple of whistlers, but they generally have a much thicker bill, and their scientific name is pachycephala, which means thick head. So they've got thicker heads, and but they are similar to thornbills in that they have normal length tails and they are drab brown birds. This is an immature rufous whistler. It's funny, they often trip people up because they don't often see them immature like this, and it's very striated on the chest. But if you were to think that this was a brown thornbill or a striated thornbill, those birds never have the striations extending down onto their body. And of course, they have a thornbill and not the thick bill that the rufous whistler has. The robins, yeah, well, look, they are yellows. Some of the thornbills are yellow. So you may mix them up with some of the SBJs, but generally they're usually easy to separate from them. An open country type robin, which is the Jackie Winter, is another bird that could be confused, I guess. Fantails are a little bit easier because they do have that fanning of the tail, which is the method that they use to flush insects and other types of invertebrates, so that they can snap them out of the air. Some of the honey eaters, perhaps some of the smaller honey eaters. I have a picture of a pretty bright one here, the eastern spinebill, but it's amazing how many people get tripped up by female scarlet honey eaters. And there are other honey eaters that are small as well. The fairy-wrens to a certain extent. Now, that we all usually see them with a cocktail, but they don't always have their tail cocked up. So, and all the field guides will tell you that, will show you a picture of a fairy-wren with the tail cocked up. So when you see this bird, for instance, you might be quite confused. And willy wagtails and fantails sometimes sit like this as well. So those types of things can trip you up as well. Pardalotes are a small bird that uses the canopy. So they're very, very high up. And unless you're very proficient with your binoculars, it can be really hard to see those bright colours, particularly on females or immature birds. So they can be an identification risk with some of the SBJs that we're going to talk about. Finches to a certain extent, but usually it's the immature manifestations. The double bar that we see on the front of a double bar finch usually should separate it from everything, but they have thick conical bills because they're a sea eater. They don't have a long sharp bill for catching insects like the thornbills and the scrub wrens. Some of the young red-browed finches are actually quite dull, but that conical bill should separate them from thornbills. Then we've got other brown striated type birds that we get in grasslands. Now, in rank grasslands where you've got actually, long grass, you don't usually get any of the thornbills in that type of habitat. So this here is a golden-headed cisticola in its winter plumage. So it's a small bird that can be confused for one of the SBJs that we're going to talk about, but that long grass is a dead giveaway. Another small brown job is the Australian reed warbler, and so they hang around and lurk in dense stuff, but it's usually associated with wetlands. But they can surprise you, and you'll see them in town sometimes. I remember Mick Roderick and I finding one in the middle of town up in a tree in Boomai, up near the Queensland border. And for a few minutes there, we were thinking, what the heck is this? But it was a reed warbler, and it was way out of its normal habitat type. The speckled warbler is in the same sort of range, a little bit bigger than the thornbills, but it is a small bird and it's got striations on its chest, so it is a identification risk as well. Okay, so our first bird we're going to look at, our first thornbill, is a yellow rump thornbill. Now, to start off with, what we're going to look at, if you can basically, as I said earlier with the brown thornbills, right? There's six thornbills that we've got in the Hunter region. One of them is a specialist species because it's really a western species. That's the inland thornbill. We'll discuss that a little bit later. And you really have to go right out in the very, very western reaches of the Hunter to be able to see one. You're not going to see one in the Newcastle LGA, for that matter. You're not going to even see one at Muswellbrook. You have to go right up the top end. But it is one of the birds that does have striations on its chest. So there's 3 species have striation on their chest, and there's 3 that have a clean breast. And the yellow rump thornbill is probably the most it's got the greatest variation in colour. It's got a very bright yellow rump. It's got a very light coloured belly. It's usually slightly buff just under the wings on the flanks, and completely different to all of the other thornbills. It has a black cap, which is sometimes only confined to the front of its forehead. It may not go right back over the cap, but it's got those little white patches, those little white diamonds on them. So that range of different things, especially that speckled cap and that bright rump, which is contrast strongly against the belly and the back, that tells us that this is a yellow rump thornbill. Of course, we don't just have to look at birds to know what they are. One of the greatest ways to get to know who's about is by their call. So only 2 of our birds, our thornbills, actually have a warbling call. That's the inland thornbill and the brown. But many of the others, a couple of the others, have whistling calls, and the yellow rump thornbill has a very twittery whistle that we hear in open places. And here it is now, hopefully.
Yellow rumped thornbill.
Can you hear that?
Nominate race.
Can you hear that, Dan?
Yeah.
So it's a very twittery call.
Race
it has a distinct. It's very distinctive. You talk to some of the experienced birders in the club, and which is most of the people I'm talking to probably, but you can hear that out the window of a car. You don't even have to look. You know, there's nothing else that delivers that twittery call that the yellow rump thornbill. And that, together with the habitat that's surrounding you, you're not going to hear that call in rainforest. You're not going to hear that in open woodland unless you're right at the edge of it, because this is a bird that loves to hop around on golf course greens and on really short grass where it catches insects off the ground. It's never really a long way from cover because they are very vulnerable to attack from other birds. And so they retire to trees and shrubs in open areas sometimes to be able to get away from other things. But it's an open country bird generally, and has that twittering call and has that distinctive plumage that nothing else has. As I said, when you look at this picture and you look at all of the different types, that's what happens when you touch your screen on an iPad. If you look at this, come on. So you look at this picture that we showed at the beginning. We're going to show this for every one of the species. So the niche, if you like, the habitat that the yellow rump thornbill likes is the open area you can see in this picture. It loves to perch on the wires of fences or on the fence posts. Like I said, it builds its nests in shrubs or in dense trees that are either out in the middle of the paddock or at the edges of woodland. But it will not enter into the forest and forage in there. It will not do that. It's an open country bird. And here's some pictures of them. Now, this bird here, you would think we've just seen that other one had a lovely white breast, and so it's giving us trouble straight away. But look at the cap. The cap is black. with white dots on it, and you can't see it always see it really well, but it has a yellow rump hidden underneath the primary feathers of its wings. You can see the yellow at the back end of this one, but this is classic, typical habitat that they like to use. And when they turn around, you can usually see that yellow rump from the back. They, like I say, when, you know, magpie comes swooping in, they'll fly up into a tree and perch, and they breed in trees and shrubs as well. Some of the birds that hang out with them in open areas that we have in the hunter, although not in big numbers, this one here, which is a southern whiteface, you often see them in other parts of the yellow rump thornbill's range. They'll be together on the ground. And finches as well. Many of the finches aren't on the ground for insects like the yellow rump thornbill. They're on the ground for seeds, but being together with other species, you've got more eyes looking for predators. This next bird looks a little bit like a yellow rump thornbill. In fact, it's actually probably the closest species that you can get to a yellow rump thornbill in our area. And this is called a buff rump thornbill, but it's quite different to a yellow rump thornbill. It doesn't have that black cap with the white dots on it, and it doesn't have a strong demarcation or contrast between the buff rump colour and the buff colour of its belly. It's pretty uniform, as you'll see with a number of things that we've got coming up. Once again, like the yellow rump thornbill, it's actually a gregarious species. They're usually found in groups together. They're not often solitary. So that's another way that we can tell different groups, different types of birds apart. Some are more solitary and some are generally in family groups. It has a tinkling sort of call as well.
Nominate race.
Here it comes. But it's far more metallic in its tone. It doesn't have that more musical way about it. It's more staccato, and it's very distinctive as well. When you hear that in woodland setting, it's a bird that can confuse you to a certain extent because it will descend to the ground. And often, I remember many of my first experiences with this bird, it was foraging on the ground. But then later on, I found that it would ascend to, depending on the different types of forest or woodland that you're in and the different strata that is contained, it will go right up into the canopy, some areas, particularly out Boggabri where I bird regularly. There's buff rump thornbills go from top to bottom, often more in the trees than they are on the ground. And you can see these pictures here. They have a faint scalloping on the forehead, not as strong as a brown thornbill, but then they're like the yellow rump thornbill. They've got a clean breast. They have no striations. But notice that very buff colour that's uniform from the back to the front. See in this picture here, the front of it actually looks quite light. So you might think it's got a lighter throat, but that's just the light. And that is something that could trick you in the field. It looks darker underneath than it is up on the front. But if you see a bird in uniform like this, well, actually the back end looks lighter than the front in this picture. So it's a very uniform bird. It has a white eye, just like the yellow rump thornbill, and there's some similarities with the places and how they actually build their nests as well. But the rump is not significantly different to the rest of the bird's underparts. You can see the buff rump there when it's opened up its wings and its tail spread out. But it is a little bit of a difficult bird to get a handle on because it doesn't have a lot of features to grab onto. But that call is very, very distinctive, and they do have that little bit of scalloping and a white eye, which is something that can help you out. But these are all pictures of the same bird. These photos that you see here, when you see a bird high up, you look at that top right-hand picture in particular, where it's up in the foliage. It's actually quite light. And that brings up the next species, which is a yellow thornbill, which is, it doesn't seem like, this seems so much brighter than these birds that you can see here, but there is a little bit of a way that you can have a harder time with these two that I'll discuss in a moment. So the yellow thornbill is a bird of the canopies. It's a gregarious species as well. And it is, as the name says, it is yellow. It doesn't generally have any scalloping on the forehead, but it has this distinctive feathers that go over the ear covers. So see just under and behind the eye, you can see those tiny little feathers there actually look like little Christmas trees. And it gives that face a distinctive pattern. You will not see this on a brown thornbill. If you see a brown thornbill at a distance, something like that won't stick out. What you'll actually see is just a big eye on a blank face. But these guys in the striated thornbill both have this arrangement of specialised feathers that are underneath their eye and go over their ear coverts that are distinctive from all the other thornbills. Like I said, it's a gregarious species, so they're usually in family groups. And these birds don't whistle. So this is the big difference between this guy here and the last two that we saw. So if the bird is doing a tinkling whistle in a forest, and you think, oh boy, it's looking yellow, it could be a yellow thornbill. If it whistles, it can't be a yellow thornbill, because a yellow thornbill has like a bzz, 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 bzz type call. So I think it's coming
Yellow
up now.
thornbill, nominate race.
There's a number of SBJs that can make that type of call, sometimes as an alarm call. Scrub wrens, brown thornbill come to mind. But, right, those guys whistle. This guy doesn't. That whistling you're hearing in the background there sounds like a buff blunt thornbill to me. Okay, so this bird, it's not to say you can't see them down at ground level, but they're essentially a canopy species. Now, the canopy, it's a strange thing. If you go to the mangroves, say over to the sand spit, and you're walking along that edge near the mangroves so that you can go out the front, you could see yellow thornbills in those tiny little shrubs that are right there. But essentially, they're still in the canopy. They're using canopy foliage. So canopy doesn't have to be very, very tall to be canopy habitat. It can be very, very low, but they're essentially foliage foragers, and they love casuarinas, and they love mangroves, but they occur right through the region in many of the different canopies of dry woodland. It'd be unusual to see them in rainforest. If you want to see a thornbill in the canopy, you'll need to go up to the wet tropics for that. But you can see here, it can be a difficult bird because it's quite small. But particularly here on the coast, where they're a bright yellow in colour, generally a brightish yellow, that yellow really is one of the key things. I know I say don't depend on colour, but that colour in combination with the call, no marks on the breast, that makes all the difference. You can see just about every part of the bird looks yellowish in colour, even though it's much brighter underneath than it is on top. The bird that's in the right-hand picture, the left-hand picture here, and then the bottom right, is actually an inland subspecies of the yellow thornbill. So compare the difference between that yellow thornbill up the top and the one down the bottom. And if you were to go out birding out Bogabri, where these pictures were taken, just, you know, not very far, out to the Liverpool Plains, and maybe in the top reaches of the Hunter region, you may encounter this other subspecies. And because it's a drab colour, you may think, oh, that could be a buff rump thornbill because it looks different to the yellow thornbills that we have here. But they've still got those same little Christmas tree feathers underneath the eye, and they've got, and yellow thornbills often have a little orange tinge just underneath the bill on the throat. The buff rump thornbill doesn't have that, and of course it is a whistling bird. Some of the things that you could confuse it for are this bird here. You can see this tiny little speck looks yellow in this picture. That's a white-throated Gerygony. There's a closer view of that same bird. And you can see it actually does have a white throat, although its plumage isn't in great condition, so the white throat doesn't really stick out very, very well in this bird. Yes.
White-throated Gerygony.
We're giving you the call of the
nominate
the
race.
white-throated Gerygony. As soon as you hear that, you know you haven't got a yellow thornbill, because a yellow thornbill wouldn't do that if it was on drugs. Another bird that is in the canopies, in those dry woodland canopies, is another Gerygony, the Western Gerygony. So it's another, if it's distant from you and it's high up, it could be a confusion risk as well. It's another bird that's solitary. This bird here is a mangrove Gerygony. And so if you're down at the sandspit or around the mangrove somewhere else, and you're seeing small birds, you may sort of think of them as being confusion risks for the thornbills, but they're distinctly different, and they have distinctive calls. They have those very liquid warbling calls. Probably the biggest confusion risk for the yellow thornbill is a weebill. And weebill gets its name because it doesn't have actually quite a long, sharp bill. It's got a shorter bill and blunter bill, like a pardalote, more like a pardalote than the yellow thornbill has. The other thing about the weebill is it tends to be a more westerly species. So you're not you're not going to see this guy in the mangroves, and they are, although they can be seen sort of down in the coalfields area, they are not very, very common in those regions. But it is generally a similar sort of a colour to yellow thornbill, and it makes those bzz, bzz, bzz type calls, but it also whistles. It has a type call. So it's as soon as it whistles, you know that it's a weebill and not a yellow thornbill. It's a gregarious species as well, so you can't separate them on that. I think I might have a call for this.
Nominate race.
There it goes. There's the whistle. Most of the time they just have a bzz sound like a yellow thornbill. And after you hear enough, they are actually different. That bzz call is different on these guys, but it does whistle quite regularly, and so it usually gives itself away. And here's the weebill. You can see it's got a bright white eye. The yellow thornbill has a light eye as well, but it's generally not as bright as this. But they've got a weebill's got a distinctive look about if you get a good view. But there you go. You can see it doesn't have those little Christmas tree feathers. Oh, here we go again. Those Christmas tree feathers on the underneath the eye, like the yellow thornbill. See that distant. So this is a yellow thornbill, one of the drab ones out Bogabri way, and quite different. The eye is a little darker. It's hard to see how long the bill is on the thornbill because it's actually looking towards us, but they are two very, very similar species. Now you'll notice this bird here actually has those same little Christmas tree type feathers over its ear coverts. This is a striated thornbill. It's actually not as bright yellow as the yellow thornbill. It's a more lemony yellow underneath, and it has an olive green back and a chestnutty coloured olive crown. But unlike all of those other birds that we've just looked at, it doesn't have a clean breast. It's actually got striations on its breast. Let's see if we've got a better picture. It, again, is a very gregarious species. It is a canopy down type species, so it spends most of its time in the canopy, and it's gregarious. It's usually in family groups, but it has a call that's like a yellow thornbill, but it doesn't sound like it starts with a bit, like a bzz, 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 bzz. It's a tss, 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 tss. And I think there's a call coming up now.
Thornbill, nominate race.
Very different in character to the yellow thornbill. And once you get your ear in on these guys, you can pick them up pretty quickly. And of course, these guys are usually in a wider sort of, in a different set of habitats, generally to yellow thornbill. Rarely you would get them sort of, together. But these guys you will find in wet sclerophyll, in the canopies of wet sclerophyll type forests and tall dry woodlands, but they're generally found in the ranges and in the coastal strip. They don't extend out west. And as this picture shows, they like the canopy, but they're a canopy down species. If you were to do a study on the thornbills, on say a brown thornbill and a striated thornbill, which actually use the same habitat much of the time, you would have that light green circle up the top would be the striated thornbill, how much more it uses that part of the forest than the smaller circle down the bottom, and then of course a tiny little circle right down the bottom. So it's a canopy down species. It uses a canopy, but it occasionally comes down. The birds will sometimes break the rules. If you turn that circle, turn that whole thing upside down, you would have the habitat usage of a brown thornbill. They are an understory upbird. Just because they spend most of their time in the understory doesn't mean that you can't see them occasionally in the canopy, but they generally like those lower stories, lower strata of the forest. And here we go. You can see the striations on the chest and the throat of a striated thornbill in this picture. You'll notice that it's got that sort of a lemony colour underneath, an olive on the wings. Can't quite see that chestnut olive on the head, but you can see the Christmas tree pattern underneath the eye over the ear coverts. You can see it quite strongly there. You can see that chestnut colour that they have over the top. And notice that it doesn't have scalloping like a brown thornbill. It actually has striations on its head. So that's quite different. Even though they've both got those striations on the breast, they're in the ballpark of the same sorts of coloration. They do completely different calls, and they have this guy's got a busy face and a brown thornbill doesn't. And that shows pretty much the classic view of what a striated thornbill looks like. It shows all of the identifying features. This one as well. So here's a brown thornbill to compare. So you've got striated thornbill here with striations on the head, little Christmas trees on its under its eyes, and it's a lemony colour with an olive back, whereas a brown thornbill is really generally a brown bird, and it has this scalloping on its head. It has a brighter eye and it's buff underneath at the back, and it's got sort of a much whiter and cleaner colour through the striations as well. So compared to many of the other thornbills that we've already seen, the brown thornbill is actually quite a solitary bird. You often see them singly or in pairs, and you don't see them in family groups, although that does happen after the breeding season. The youngsters spend a while with their parents, but generally for much of the year, you don't see them hanging around in family groups. They're an understory bird, and as we were talking about, they're a ground up.
Brown thornbill, nominate race.
Now you hear that call. There's a warble in it. The brown thornbill is the only thornbill, well, apart from the inland that we'll see a little bit later, that has a warble in its call. It has none of the others do that. Striated is just a sound, and same with the yellow. The other guys have tinkling songs, but this guy has a little warble, and that distinctive warble can be heard quite some distance, way before you see the bird in a ferny understory, and you can tell what they're about. They're often hard to get a very good view of. These guys are always on the move, moving through the foliage trying to find insects, and can be hard to get a really good look. But hearing that little warbling call is one of the best ways to pick them up and to identify that it's actually the SBJ that you've got in front of you. As I was saying before, this bird is a lower story up. The thing is, you'll notice here, though, that circle doesn't reach the ground. Brown thornbill will go right down and perch on the bottom stalks of shrubs, but they generally don't hop on the ground. They're a shrub, a mid-story bird. They will go up into the canopy on occasion, but that's relatively rare. Here's that picture we had a little bit earlier. There's all those classic things that the brown thornbill has. A general buff at the back there, a cleaner white where the striations are, that red eye and that chestnut scalloping, and of course a brownish back. In some light, the brown thornbill can actually look quite olive on the back. So you have to be careful of that. So the big way that you separate them from the striated thornbill is that much less busyness on the face of this guy and the scalloping he has instead of the striations on the head. Here's a picture. That's the other thing that I haven't mentioned. Birds can fluff out their feathers like this bird has, or they can pull them in like this one. They're both brown thornbills, and yet they look quite different. Someone will say, the bird I saw was distinctively puffy in the breast and it had this bulging forehead. That bird, it can't be that bird. Look, its feathers are all down against its head. It doesn't have the puffy breast. They are the same bird. It's interesting that the feathers that are on the chest of a brown thornbill actually do have some dark tinges, but a lot of the striation look that you actually get is actually caused by the shadows between the forest of feathers, which are almost like those little Christmas tree, look like pine forest type feathers that the striated and the yellow have on their ear coverts. At a long distance, the thing that sticks out with a brown thornbill is that eye with hardly any features around it. It really is a distinctive thing at a long distance, and that general drab brown sort of buffy colour is also a good way to tell them apart. Now, compare this bird to this bird. This bird looks like it's a brown thornbill, but it looks like somebody took bleach to it and took all the colour out of it. This bird here is an inland thornbill. Now, inland thornbill has the scalloping on the forehead just like the brown thornbill, has the striations on the breast, just like a brown thornbill. It has a reddish eye. It's not bright red like the brown thornbill. It's more an orangey colour. And the other thing that it has, even though it can have a little bit of buff feathers down on the lower around the vent and those rear feathers just before the vent, it's generally very, very white right through. Not as brown as a brown thornbill. It's not as warm. It's a more cold-looking bird, but it has a distinct chestnut tail. The tail is the rump is distinctly chestnut in colour. It contrasts very strongly with the undercolour, whereas a brown thornbill, you don't see that distinction between those two. It, like the brown thornbill, is solitary, and its calls do have warbles in them.
Inland thornbill, nominate race.
So those calls sound a lot like a brown thornbill, but believe me, this rotten bird, it is tough. Its calls are tough. You go out in the forest where you get these guys out around Boggabri, and then they go right, throughout much of inland Australia using, scrubby areas. But there's another way you can tell them apart. Have a look at the colour of the legs on that guy compared to the colour of the legs on these guys. They're all sort of a like pinkish brown, and this guy's black. So brown thornbills don't have black legs. So, but this bird here, I find at Boggabri, has an incredible repertoire. Different individuals right through the area, and I have to cover a lot of different areas in the places where I work. They have this incredible range of different calls they make, and they'll use the calls of other birds to bolster their own songs. And you'll hear this thing that sounds weird. It's not big enough to be a whistler. You can tell by the sound, but yeah, it can be very, very confusing if you're trying to pick it up by the warble, expecting to hear the warbling call. Now, it's a little bit different to the brown thornbill, but it seems like it's like the buff-rumped. Buff-rumped thornbill on the coast is sometimes close to the ground, but when you go out west, it ascends more. The inland thornbill uses the canopy far more than any brown thornbill ever does. It loves calitris, the cypress pines, and it ascends right up through the top of those, and will sometimes ascend up into the canopy of woodland trees. It can be a little bit difficult, but it has those same characteristics as a brown thornbill. There are rumours that they do overlap some places, but I'm yet to actually see the two side by side. And the place out at Boggabri, where I do quite a bit of work, we have the New England tableland up the top of one of the properties. And as you ascend up the ridge, you run into striated thornbills, and you'll get brown thornbills at the top, but you'll never get inland thornbills up there, and you never get brown thornbills down the bottom in those inland woodlands. So it'd be interesting to see if they actually do overlap. Now here we go. You can see it does have that. It doesn't have a really rich red eye. It's a little bit buff in the back, but it looks like a brown thornbill in this picture. But here, this is the distinct. You see how it's buff in the back. It's got the black legs. The scalloping. This is a classic scalloping of an inland thornbill. It's like you bleached all of that chestnut out of a brown thornbill's forehead, and it's actually black and white. This is as bold as it gets. there are a range of different that they can be quite duller, much duller than that. But see how much contrast you've got in that chestnut rump against the colours underneath. You don't see that in a brown thornbill as well. Here's a younger bird. You can see it looks a little bit browner, but it's still got that bleached sort of a look. It's not warm in tone like a brown thornbill. This bird here, you can see here, is an inland thornbill in one of its favourite foraging positions in cypress palm. So these are the guys that we have trouble with trying to pick apart because they're all striated on the breast. So you've got a brown thornbill up in the top right-hand corner. You've got inland thornbill down the bottom for comparison. Notice the difference in the contrast between the chestnut rump on the inland thornbill compared to the brown, and look how much of the tint and that brown tone is actually out of the inland thornbill. It's actually a much more like plain, neutral coloured bird than the brown is. And look how quite different the striated thornbill actually is to those guys. Even though he's got a striated breast, he has different feathers on the face. The other guys have got little round feathers, but this guy's got these little Christmas trees, and of course he has those striations on the head. Some of the birds that you could mistake for them are the chestnut rump teeth wrens. This guy isn't a chestnut rump teeth wren. This is at Nombinnie National Park. This is a shy heath wren, but you get the idea. The heath wrens are quite striated on the chest, and so you might see a bird like this. And even the cocktail, the brown thornbill, will do that sometimes. So they are a bit of a confusion risk. Brown gerygony is not a bird that you should actually confuse with a brown thornbill because it's got no striations on its breast and has those little white tips to its tail feathers as well, if you can't see the top side of it. But they do live in the same habitat, and they're very small birds, and they are often a confusion risk. And half the way of understanding what bird you have in front of you is knowing what you could get in a certain habitat. So when you go into wet sclerophyll forest, your confusion risks down in those lower understory and just up into the mid-story are going to be brown gerygony, brown thornbill, and white-browed scrub wren. White-browed scrub wren is quite bright in colour, but the female isn't. I think we've got the call here of a... It's a classic call. It's what is it on the brown gerygony, which is quite different to the brown thornbill. They are a gregarious species as well, whereas a brown thornbill tends to be a little more on the solitary side. Here's a brown gerygony here with a young bird. So this is another thing. Another thing you have to deal with. You have to deal with birds of different ages. This young brown gerygony looks very different to its adult, which is next to it. There's a white-browed scrub wren we were talking about. No striations, although some parts of Australia you'll find white-browed scrub wrens with striations down the front of them. Particularly the guys down in South Australia and in Western Australia. Here's a white-browed scrub wren. It's a confusion risk, one of the biggest confusion risks with a brown thornbill, particularly the females, because they don't have such a white brow and they can actually look quite plain.
White-browed.
We've got a call for those.
Nominate race.
White-browed scrub wren screams at the top of its lungs. They are generally a gregarious species, so they live in family groups as well. But these guys are down in the very lower parts and generally in denser vegetation. So they do hop around on the ground. But they've got those little, you see the alula, those little white and black feathers that are on the carpal joint of the wing there. A brown thornbill doesn't have those. So if you see that, it's all over.
White-browed
now we've got
scrub wren,
another
nominate,
thornbill that we get in wet habitats, which is the large-billed scrub wren. Large-billed scrub wren is perhaps the bird that in our region, amongst the SBJs, that have the least amount of markings. They've got the plainest face. They've got a longer than normal bill, and their eye stands out on a featureless face. They can look a range of different colours under different lights, but they are generally a yellowy, olivey colour, a little bit more buffy yellow underneath and more olivey on top. It is a very beautiful bird, even though it doesn't have a wide range of colours. One of my favourites, and it's great to watch them foraging in vine thickets. We've got a call coming up. No, good. So this is a yellow-throated scrub wren, which is another confusion risk for those birds that you get in the wet forest. This guy just about exclusively lives on the ground. They hop around and find stuff in the leaf litter. You can see that the nest is a big concern that's made of roots and bits of rotted leaf. And this is a female, so she has quite a brown face. The male is dark between the eyebrow and the throat, and that's how you can pick the two apart. But they're generally in pairs that you see them unless it's in the breeding season. There's a male there with a much darker face. That was in the days. These ones are taken off slides that I took now it'd be about 40 years ago. So here we go. Here's your thornbills that have no striations on their breast. But look how different they actually quite are when you get to compare them up close like this. Buff rump thornbill down in the right-hand bottom corner is quite drab in comparison to a yellow thornbill. And there's quite a distinction between the breast, the rump, the face, and the cap on a yellow rump thornbill, much more than the other birds. Here's our striated-breasted guys again. And now, after all of that, you should be able to tell what that bird is there. Since I mentioned it does like casuarina. And this one here, if you had a good memory of seeing the bird from front on, you should know what this guy is as well. This is a brown thornbill. And of course, no prizes for this one. It's on the grass and it's got a yellow rump. There's only one bird that can be. And now that skulker that was in the understory along Boys Walk in Cooranbong with a big eye on, you can always make out that featureless face and a long bill. That's a large-billed scrub wren. This guy, who loves calitris and doesn't have a lot of colour in him, that's the inland thornbill. And of course, there's a wee bill and a yellow thornbill for comparison. So that's how you'll see them out in those western woodlands. Those two birds are actually quite similar at a distance. Which brings us to, it was only 2 days ago that I realised that I was going to do a little segment in this on fairy wrens as well. I've probably rambled on for long enough, but I'm going to give you a quick talk about how to identify fairy wrens. We'll concentrate on the variegated fairy wren and the superb fairy wren because they are most commonly seen down here in the lower hunter. We won't discuss some of the more difficult species, like the purple back, which could be in the western areas. But when you look at them side by side like this, they are quite completely different. They are completely different tones. The light areas in the underparts of a variegated fairy-wren and the wings have got this buff look about them, whereas the superb fairy-wren is actually quite white. But even the blue on the head is completely different. The superb fairy-wren on the right in this picture has got a bit of light showing on his throat, which shows that they are actually blue in that location. You can see it's actually dark. It's got a rim of dark feathers around the bottom, but the throat itself is actually blue. But the other thing is they've both got blue heads, but the variegated fairy-wren, the blue that's on the ear coverts joins the blue that goes over the cap. Notice that the superb fairy-wren is generally a black-headed bird that has blue ear coverts and a blue cap. So if you think of it as being just a completely black head with a couple of blue dots on it, makes it quite different to what the variegated fairy-wren looks like. And here's a comparison between the two, but we've got them flipped over. Both the superb fairy-wren and the variegated fairy-wren females have reddish colour around the eyes. But notice, right, how well demarcated and how much darker it is on that right-hand bird than the bird that's in the left-hand picture. The bird in the left-hand picture is a superb fairy-wren female, and the bird that's on the right is a variegated fairy-wren. She's much darker in that laurel colour and that eye ring that goes around the eye, and it is more strongly demarcated at the edges than it is on a superb fairy-wren. Superb fairy-wren has a more orangey look about its eyes. The other guy's a little bit more rusty, brick red type colour. The colour in the tails is a little bit hard to compare in these photographs, but both females of the variegated fairy-wren and adult female in the superb fairy-wren have blue tails. The female superb fairy-wren's blue in her tail is much lighter than that of a male, and that's one of the clues you can use to tell them apart when they're in similar plumages. Here we see two male superb fairy-wrens. A superb fairy-wren on the left and a variegated fairy-wren on the right. Now, how can I tell it's a male? Well, as I alluded to in that last picture, if we go back and look at it, compare that superb fairy-wren female that's on the left there, and then compare the colour of her tail to the male in this picture. See how much deeper the blue is? I know the light is different in these two pictures, but his tail is much, much lighter, much deeper in blue colour than hers. It's a much gentle, more softer blue on her tail. The other thing is too, notice she's got a red bill and she's got that reddish colour around the eye, and this bird doesn't. It has a black bill. This bird is an eclipse male superb fairy-wren. So he's gone out of his adult coloration, that breeding plumage that he gets, or alternate plumage, and this happens generally through the winter months for these birds. You will see coloured birds through the middle of the year, but there's a number of reasons that can happen. They tend to think, I'm not sure if they've sorted it out yet, but some males, once they get to a certain age, can hold the colour right through the winter period. But the other thing that often happens is that superb fairy-wrens will breed, well, whenever they can. So they will breed, if you have a really warm sort of autumn, March through to April period, these birds will still be breeding if there's insects around to feed their young. Well, the young males that are later in the season, when they change out of their their immature plumages, they often go straight into an adult male plumage. And so they'll often get that plumage just before winter. And so a bird that you see could be actually a young bird. But notice the difference between the bird on the left and the bird on the right. The variegated fairy-wren is much more buff overall in coloration. You'll notice that the male actually has a white eye ring around his eye. Now, the superb fairy-wren, you look on the left-hand side, he actually has a bit of a light ring on the bottom half of his eye. You'll often see them light on the bottom, but you don't often see them with a full ring like the variegated fairy-wren. But notice how far the buff coloration travels up towards the throat. It's only the very throat itself that's white on the variegated fairy-wren, whereas that white coloration extends much further down the breast on a superb fairy-wren as well. Of course, their coloration of their tails is quite different as well. Now, this bird here, we look at this bird and you see it's got some mixed traits. It's got a dark blue tail, it's got a dark bill, but it's red around the eye. What the heck is going on here? Well, this is an immature male superb fairy-wren that has just, so when all the fairy-wrens are born, they all come out like females, but except for one thing, they all have brown tails, but they all have orange bills, they all have orange in the lores, and they all have orange around the eyes. But if you look very closely at the picture on the left there, you'll notice there's a couple of blue feathers coming in just in front of the eye and below the eye, and he has a black bill. Female fairy-wrens, superb fairy-wrens, do not have black bills. This guy is actually maturing up into an adult plumage for his very first time. So much so that the blue is coming out on his face before the orange has faded. Often these birds will start to fade in that orange. Their feathers will get really old and worn, and you may not be able to see very much orange there at all. And you only see, and the bill will be predominantly orange in colour. But you'll notice a few dots of black coming in the bill, and that's a giveaway as well. But when you look at that picture on the right-hand side, you can see that bird's clearly got some light blue feathers at the back there, but look at that big, bold, darker blue one in the front. That's the colour of an adult male superb fairy-wren. So he's on his way to maturing into a full coloration, but he might trick you because of that orange around the eye. But the black bill and that coloration that he's got in the tail, they're a dead giveaway that he's not a female, he's actually a male. And we look at these pictures here. So you can see that last bird we looked at, and this is sort of shows you that there is some variation in how they gain their colours. Look at that bird in the left-hand picture there. You'll notice, right, that it's actually quite dark around the eye, although the colour in the eye there around the outline of the eye is actually pink skin, right, just like a female. And notice, right, he's still, even though he's lost most of that orange around the eye, he's still retained a lot of that red in the bill, and his bill is starting to colour up from the tip back. If you look on the other side, you can see here when I went out with Joy Nichols, we caught some variegated fairy-wrens, and this bird was just changing. You can see he's got a predominantly orange bill, but notice the black streaks in it, and you can see he's already having the colour coming. So you see this bird, well, here we go. You look at these two birds here and compare with these guys. What you can see here is this bird here is looking a lot like the variegated fairy-wren that we've got there, except his bill has gone black much quicker than either of these birds. And you can see the adult plumage coming out clearly in this variegated fairy-wren on the right. Even the chestnut that the variegated fairy-wren has on the shoulder is starting to come out. So even though the fairy-wrens seem like they're a fairly boring affair, being able to sex the different birds, and all birds are very will have these stages of plumage changes that they have. A classic example is the satin bowerbird. The satin bowerbird takes 7 years. It's his 7th year when he attains that satin colour. But he goes through a range of different plumages. He looks like a female in the first year, and then his bill starts to turn the light colour of the adult male, and he gets the purple eye of the adult male, and he goes from a greenish colour and starts to go much deeper browns and yellows in his green plumage as he gets closer to the time when he'll change into that satin. So all birds go through this stage of aging in its feathers, in their plumages, and changing them. The fairy-wrens are interesting from that point of view, that there's something that's far more accessible for you to cut your teeth on at getting to understand how birds actually transition from young plumages into older ones. And so you can take those skills that you learn on a bird that's very accessible, like the fairy-wrens, and be able to and take those skill sets to a much wider group of birds. So that's it. Now, how do I get rid of it?
Good on you, Al. That was brilliant.
Yeah, it was really good. Very abrupt ending.
Well, look,
Well, you by surprise, Dan.
Yeah, you did.
Did you want me to keep going?
No, you're all good.
No, Al.
Yes.
Very good,
But
Al.
anyway, yeah, good out. No worries.
Yeah, lots of positive feedback. Yeah, a lot to take in for some people, I'd imagine. It's always good as just a refresher for some of us older hens as well. It's really fabulous presentation, Al.
Yeah.
We are dragging on a little bit, bogged down in 1,000 questions, but if anyone's got some burning questions to ask Al, then yeah, please make yourself known. I guess there's a few avenues through the chat. You can shout out, or you can stick your hand up and wave or whatever. But yeah, we've got time for a few.
How do I'm trying to work out? Oh, there I am.
Can I just make a comment?
Yes. As long as it's good.
Yeah, no. So I sometimes run workshops on how to identify, acknowledge woodland birds, and
yeah,
the point that I didn't really come out in your presentation though, Al. The point is that if you're a beginner, you shouldn't be too daunted, because over time you will come to recognize these birds. You won't have to identify these birds any longer, because you will recognize them. A spotted pardalite, there's no way on earth I could describe to anyone what a spotted pardalite looks like, but I recognize it. So it's an important point that you never actually have to know every detail with birds that you encounter in a forest. There might be some examples like maybe the Georginis, but if you want to get proficient with seabirds or shorebirds, you have to know every detail. But with these birds, you don't necessarily need to know. Like, you will come to recognize these birds with time. So yeah, don't be too daunted.
I just remember being out in the forest close to my home, just along Stockton Creek, and having a brown thornbill before me, and not having any idea why, whether it was a striated or a brown. I remember what it was like having a hard time with these birds and wanting to know what they were. And I remember, like, the pain of not being able to get a decent view. Half the problem for all of the people who try to go out there as keen as mustard, but they can't. You'll see all these different behaviours from a bird, like what you're saying, right? Right, is that you get to know a bird by basically the niche and who it is. It's like, and this is an analogy I often use, is that is the people sort of say, you know, they can't work out what birds are, but what you're talking about rings true. I often say to people, if you're sitting at the Christmas table with a blindfold on and you've got your whole family around, you know exactly who's talking. So bird calls and how people are talking, right, are similar. They all have different tones and different delivery. They talk about different subject matter. They have a different lisp, or they have, you know, a stutter or something like that. And you walk down Pitt Street and your partner is walking 200 metres in with piles of people. You see them at a distance. What you're saying is you can't put your finger on it, but when you look at it, your brain knows what it is. But generally, right, when people start out, that they don't have that. They've got to, the way that you can actually get that information to actually put it to a species is you have to identify it somehow. And that's the hardest thing. So you need these little tips to, you know, about what they do, how they call. Call is so important. As we know, most of us who are experienced birders, we do all our lists by call, so much so that I've got bad at looking at birds because I depended on listening to them so much.
Yeah, good points there, Al. And like, yeah, one of the things that to sort of off the back of that is kind of like you mentioned. Obviously, you played the warbly call of brown thornbill. When it does its classic warble, it's very obvious what it is. But you know, there's a lot of the times it will do kind of a different call, but it has that warbly tone to it, and so you know, even though it's not that classic call, you know it's a brown thornbill because of the kind of character and the quality of the call, not by what it's actually saying.
Exactly. We don't know the people that we love by what they're actually saying. We know them by the tone of their voice. It's exactly the same with birds. And I mean, a lot of people will listen to calls, and then it's just like imprinting on the identification pictures in a field guide. They'll imprint on a recording they hear, and when they go out and they don't hear that exact call, they go, well, it can't be that bird. When they were listening to the wrong thing. You're actually listening to the delivery, how it does it. There's rules about calls, like small birds might make generally softer calls and more high-pitched calls. Bigger birds have bigger voices so they can make louder calls. So whenever you go into it, I've just been to Cape York, right? And there's a stack of birds up there that I've never heard. And on top of that, right, there's a bunch of populations of birds that are similar to the ones down here, but they're like 3,000 kilometres apart. So the way that they call up there and the way they deliver things is completely different. But taking what I know about how I actually identify things here from their call, as soon as I go up there, I hear something call, I know straight away whether it's a small bird or whether it's a big bird or whether it's a medium bird. Listen to those classic calls that you get from things like white-eared honeyeater and singing honeyeater and Lewin's honeyeater. They are classic tone and delivery type calls. Like they all are different, but the way they deliver their call and that vocal range and volume that they deliver it is exactly the same. And I remember going out doing work in the Upper Hunter and hearing this honeyeater call, and it was driving me nuts. It drove me nuts for like a month or two. I couldn't work out what it was. Every time I go and find this bird, I'd find another bird there instead. And then one day it called and I looked around and there it was sitting up on a stick on the top of a tree. It was a cicada bird. A cicada bird has a second call, right? That's not like the cicada call. It sounds like it should be a white-eared honeyeater or a singing honeyeater. And it was a mongrel. I had no, because of that, of what I knew how honeyeaters call and the delivery. You listen to it sometime. It's on the apps, but you wouldn't know to look there.
They do it quite often, actually. Like,
Yes,
yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're a rotter. They were a rotter. I got them now.
All right. Unless anyone else has a desperate burning question I need to ask, we might leave it there. So I'll just give 10 seconds for anyone that has
Thanks,
a question
Al.
they need to ask now, or
No worries.
you know, they're just not going to be able to sleep tonight. Yeah. Anyway, excellent. No, again, I'll yeah, very, very well done, Al. And yeah, I reckon a lot of people have certainly got their money's worth tonight and learned quite a lot. So yeah, many thanks and a round of applause to Al.
Thank you.
No worries, mate. Good to see you.